Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and I couldn't decide between a shark and a dinosaur this week, so I did the only reasonable thing and I combined them to make Sharkosaurus Rex Apex Predator. And like any waterborne apex predator that's an amalgamation of two top-tier killing machines, Sharkosaurus Rex's bones are made of an aluminium foil that's compressed as tightly as my weak little wrists can squeeze it. I'm going to be sinking it in a gallon of resin, and any potential pocket of air hidden inside the clay will undoubtedly come back to haunt me later, so a little extra prep work now will go a long way later. Or it won't make a difference and it'll all go tits up anyways. Who knows, that's the fun of resin. For now though, I've got the general shape of my toothy murder torpedo figured out, so I can get to adding some extra thick leg bones, which I'll make by twisting some heavy gauge armature wire into a circle, then wrapping it around the midsection of Paul's body, about where I imagine his legs would be. I'll then bend the legs so they're pointing downwards and I don't accidentally make him upside down before covering the wire in some lumps of clay and mounting him so I can finally get to the finer details. With my legs in place, I've got a better idea of how big Paul's gonna be, so I'll start to bulk up the body a bit more by lengthening the tail and adding large worms of clay to his belly and backside until I've got a slightly more shark-accurate shape. His legs are a little stork-like at this point, but before I bend them into shape, I'm gonna measure out the length of each section so I can make sure that both my legs are identical in size. I had to guess a bit here since I couldn't find the actual length of a Sharkosaurus Rex leg, so I hope any marine biologist watching can forgive my anatomical inaccuracies. To make his mouth, I'll carve out a section at the front of his face, then stick a little lump of clay to the underside and blend it in. Then I can start to thicken up his jowls and neck muscles before giving him the Hollywood treatment and plumping up his lips and giving him a nice strong nose and eyebrow ridge. I don't know what species of shark makes up half of Paul's genetic code, but I tend to default to making great whites when I make sharks, so I guess that's kinda what's going on here. That being said, the noble Sharkosaurus Rex is in a category of its own, so any similarities or differences are purely coincidental. Otherwise, I've got the overall shape looking ship-shape, so I'll go back to my mouth and start to add the little details, starting by wrinkling up the inside of the mouth to make it look a little more realistic, then adding the gummy lining to the upper and lower lips so I have room to ram some teeth into place. Speaking of which, it's time to make some teeth. To make a full set of shark teeth, I'll roll a teeny tiny ball of clay into a teenier tiny wormy dealy of clay that I can then smoosh flat and cut a surplus of little triangles out of. I'll then press them flat with my finger, toss them into the oven to bake so they're nice and hard, then I can jam them into those predefined tooth-holding lip liners that I added earlier. I'll poke an oversized divot for his eyeball, which I can push into place, then cover in a slew of little worms of clay to build up the always important angry shark eyebrow before stabbing some sniffing holes in the front of his face, adding a bit of lumpy texture around his neck, and finally slicing some gills along the side of his body. Admittedly, the gills took a few tries since the first few attempts didn't take into account the fact that I would need to leave a gap for the arms, and my poor planning means that I may have put his legs a little too far forward. This means that the gills are a bit closer to the mouth than I would have wanted, but given that this is how the Sharkosaurus Rex evolved, and Paul is, after all, the ultimate apex predator, who am I to question the design? Paul's gonna have some traditionally teeny tiny T-Rex arms, but he's also half shark and I wanted to pay homage to his underwater origins, so I made his little arms as slightly elongated fins first before cutting the tips in twain and turning them into some little wonky T-Rex fingers. I can then bend them as necessary, stab some little holes for little talons, and affix them to Paul's body behind the gills before adding some more lumps on top to help blend them into the body. At this point, I'm now a seashell bra away from Paul cosplaying as the Little Mermaid, so it's time to add some big old T-Rex legs. Like everything else, I'll start by squishing lumps of clay in place until I've got a baseline shape I can start to fine-tune. The only thing worth noting is that since I gave Paul a pretty mean lean to the left, I'm gonna be leaving the wire beneath the right leg untouched since it's only there to provide support for Paul when I add his unfortunate victim later, so the right leg actually ends halfway up the armature. Otherwise, I can bulk up his belly and thicken up the underside of his legs before adding lots of wrinkles by way of little wormy dealies blended into the folds of the skin around his various dino fish limbs. Then all that's left to do is add his various fins. Finally, with my fins finished and the final form figured out, I can get to the texturing, starting by putting on a pair of blue nitrile gloves. The grippy tip of these gloves are ever so slightly textured and make for excellent shark skin texture that's also fun to apply. I am having a good time. Of course, Paul's an apex predator in the underwater hellscape that is the ocean, so he's gonna need a plethora of battle wounds and scars, which I'll make by covering him in a plastic wrap before slicing up his skin with my silicone shapers. A common question I get is, why do I use the cling film before cutting marks into the clay? Now, if you were to just cut directly into the soft clay with a sharp tool, you're left with sharp cuts and ragged edges. However, if you slap a little cling film on top first, then cut into the clay, the cling film keeps the edges softer and leaves you with smoother cuts that look more natural versus the sharper cuts without. Of course, if I'm using really soft silicone shapers like my Barely There Baby Fart Soft White shapers, the cling film doesn't really do anything. With the softer full body scars and battle damage in place, I can start to add some deeper, more aggressive wrinkles and cuts in strategically placed positions around the body. Otherwise, Paul's upper body is finished, so all I need to do is make his feet. As I mentioned earlier, Paul's going to be standing on the body of his latest victim, which will be this unfortunate shark that I made off camera and pressed flat onto my baking tray so that I can stab Paul's exposed armature into the center of it. Then it's just a case of building Paul's foot on top. With Paul's paws in place, I can start to turn our unfortunate victim into shark sashimi by cutting lots of little slices and cuts into its body. I also thought the tail looked kinda crappy, so rather than fix it and make it look better, I'm just gonna chop it off and replace it with a lumpy lump of flesh instead. Otherwise, that's Paul and the poor nameless fellow finished, so I can toss it all in the oven to cure before popping it off the tray so I can mark out the size of the base on this scrap piece of MDF, which I'll then cut down to size using my knife. Admittedly, it probably would have been a lot less harrowing to use a saw, but I couldn't find mine on account of not looking for it, so a knife will have to do. In the future though, I think I'll use the saw. To make the bottom of my ocean, I've rolled some thinnish sheets of clay flat so I can layer them onto the base, cut the sides flush with the MDF, then press Paul into place and build up a bit of clay around his feet and his food. I can then pop Paul off the base and crack out my favorite texturizing tool, a rock. Then it's just a case of carefully and masterfully applying my texture. Of course, I might have jumped the gun with the rocky texture since I decided that I would rather my ocean have a sandy bottom, which I'll make by rolling my rollers along the bottom till I've got lots of little sand dunes and, sadly, very little rocky texture. Finally, not wanting my rocks to feel left out, I've picked a few choice pieces that I can squish into the clay so that I can glue them in later. For now though, it's time to get to painting. A white primer will turn my Sharkosaurus Rex into a great white Sharkosaurus Rex ready for some color. I'll start by base coating the base with a coat of bone white, which I'll then follow with a coat of darker brown wash to help give the scar texture a bit more definition. Once that's dried, I'll use my sponge to dab some messy white top coat over the bone white to help bring the light color back while still leaving the darker color in all the nooks and crannies. Paul's upper half gets a base coat of dark gray tinted with just a touch of blue to give me a really nice dark gray shark tone, which I'll apply very carefully along the joining line of the white underside. I'll then give his little floor friend a lighter gray coat so they don't blend together. Then I'll tickle Paul's top with a lighter gray dusting before turning the pressure on my airbrush really low so it's just speckling him with some very light grays. I thought the two colors were a little too blended, so I'll roughen it up a bit with a stiff brush before getting to work painting his mouth and lips red. Then the shark sushi gets its various chewed up parts painted red before I come back and repaint all Paul's teeth shark tooth white and both pairs of eyes black. The more aggressive scars and cuts along Paul's body I'll paint with an initial pink before touching up the deeper cuts with a little red. Finally, for a little color variation, I'll paint some pink into the big battle wound on the little shark before painting Paul's toenails and talons black. With his toes done, that's the last of Paul painted, which means I can carry the black over the base, giving the sides a nice black base coat before coating the entire topside with a mustardy yellow sand. The color here isn't really important or necessary, since I'll be covering it in a second, but I'm kinda making all this up as I go, and I didn't know until I was finished painting that this was just a waste of time. At this point, I figured if the base was going to be sandy, then why not use sand? Of course, the sand I have is a bit too coarse and grainy for this scale, so rather than sand, I'll use some sand-colored grout. A base of thinned-out PVA glue will hold it in place on the bottom, and I can activate the top with a spritz of isopropyl alcohol followed by a heavy dosing of more PVA glue. Once it dries, it'll be rock hard, and the isopropyl alcohol causes it to crack in spots, adding some extra texture. Finally, before it dries, I'll drop some little rocks on top for that last bit of texture. Once it's dried, I can pop Paul into place, then glue my little rocks into their preordained resting spots with a couple dabs of PVA glue. All that's left to do then is make an ocean, which means I need to make a frame. To make the frame, I've put Paul in the center of a large sheet of Perspex, then using a bit of CA glue to hold them in place and some machining blocks to keep them square to the base, I've put 4 sides of Perspex around Paul and his floor. The CA glue will keep the walls in place, and a thick bead of silicone will both ensure the Perspex is glued together as well as give me a resin-proof barrier that I know is watertight. I'm going to be pouring 4 liters of resin, and I don't have a bucket that big, so I've repurposed this bathroom garbage bin and marked out the 2 levels for each part of my epoxy mix. Then it's just a case of pouring part A to the part A line and part B to the part B line and hoping that my basic knowledge of grade school ratios doesn't fail me now. To tint my ocean blue, I'll mix in a couple drops of blue and a couple drops of green dye, then mix it all up again. Of course, given the amount of resin I'm pouring and despite my best efforts, I've managed to introduce a bubble or two to the resin that I want to remove before I pour it. So to remove the bubbles, I'm gonna vacuum them out. This nifty little vacuum chamber uses the power of science to suck the air out of the chamber, which causes all the little bubbles to rise to the top of the resin and pop, leaving me with a nice clear, nearly bubbleless resin. The remaining surface bubbles can be popped with a heat gun or a torch, and I'm ready to start pouring. I don't want any bubbles trapped under the base, so I'm gonna lay down a thin layer of resin and make sure it's spread out to cover the whole surface before I fit the sandy bottom in place. Then I can use a little resin under Paul and his friend before getting to the rest of the pour. Before I pour the resin though, I've set up what I like to call my anti-atom resin planning platform. This will catch any resin that pours out the sides of the frame as a result of my poor planning and shoddy design. After all, Murphy's Law is a law that states if something can go wrong, it will. Here in the UK we have Sod's Law, which is the same thing, but we've also got Cole's Law, which is really just cabbage and mayonnaise. I also thought it might be kinda neat to have a bit of red blood mixing with the blue of the ocean, so I took a tiny bit of the resin before I added the blue and mixed in some red dye. Finally, I'm ready to clench every orifice I have and pour 4 liters of resin on top of my lovingly crafted Sharkosaurus Rex and hope for the best. 72 hours later and the resin has cured, and it's looking pretty okay. It got a bit too hot and left a few bubbles around the front and the back, and I guess my efforts to prevent the bubbles from the base fell through, which left me with some pretty ugly bubbles right in the middle of Paul's feet. Also, I forgot to take into account the fact that the Sharkosaurus Rex is known to be one of the most flatulent fish in the ocean, so there's a pretty substantial bubble emerging from his backside. All in all, apart from the numerous flaws, I'd say this is a pretty flawless result. However, I think I can probably fix at least a couple of the glaring issues. The first step will be filling in the surface bubbles in the front and the back, which I can do by removing only the front and back perspex. This will leave me with a half frame on the sides, which will let me fill in the gaps with some UV resin. It's not a perfect solution since there's an obvious seam between the resins, but that's nothing I can't Photoshop out for the thumbnail. With that done, I can remove the rest of the perspex, then flip the whole thing over and drill a teeny tiny hole through the base into the big air bubble in the bottom. I'll then mix up a little quicksand resin and pump that into the hole until the bubble is mostly filled. Because the walls of the bubble are still obvious though, I added a bit of red resin in the hopes that the bloody water might make it a little less obvious, and I think it makes a huge difference. It looks like Paul's standing in dirty bloody water rather than being attacked from beneath by the T-1000. I tried to fix the back bubbles off camera and managed to make it look significantly worse, but that's easily fixed by putting it on a shelf and not turning it around. Otherwise, the last thing I want to do is add the wavy water on top, which I'll do by adding a big wobbly bead of clear silicone and spreading it out with a finger and a misting of isopropyl alcohol. The waves both help to hide the imperfection of the resin pour that bubbled out the top, as well as provide terrific lighting in the glamour shots. Speaking of which, it's time for the glamour shots. As always, a big ol' thank you to the fine folk of Patreon who continue to support me despite my predilection towards overly flatulent shark-related sculptures. And a very special shout out to my newest patrons, Alex, Sky Casper, Ongoing Crisis, Huevos Rancheros, Jason Robinson, Barry Cream, Maeve W, James Briscoe, Lorna Saff, Aaron McDaniel, Alex L, Phoenix Cummings, Tall, Sari Scarverton, Flying Grizzly, Anaya Mac, Vermermal Slap, Evil Monkey 95, Zen AF, NE1609, Bethany Watt, Call Me Ash, Hollow Angel, Dave Medeiros, Cops and Robbers, Did You Say Bloopers Henry Suddeth, and Fizzgig. You are the dinosaur legs that hold up this shark that's already technically a dinosaur. This is the part of the video where I ask you to like, subscribe, and comment, so please, for the love of all that's good and pure in this world, don't forget to